Welcome to Session 3 of the Preventive Legal Advocacy Virtual Summit. Session 3 is Investing in Families, Funding Preventive Legal Advocacy and Pre-Petition Programs. Our presenters on Session 3 panel are Jey Rajaraman, Associate Director of Litigation at the ABA Center on Children and the Law, Ronald Baze, General Counsel at the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, and Lauren Nichols, Director of the Pritzker Foster Care Initiative and the Anthony and Jean Pritzker Family Foundation.
Emily and I've done a few presentations together. So these slides, I want to make sure I give her credit. Many of this comes out of the PLA work itself and the cohort. So just to note that, along with recent work on the upcoming notice of rulemaking, which I'll reference. But just generally, where does funding come from? How do we fund early legal defense prevention work? And so just wanted to reference this slide, which was created out of a survey that Emily's team had done on PLA programs on funding. And so thank you, Ron. Go ahead, you can click away. That the majority comes from rely on more than one funding source. Here you can note state funding or private foundation grants. You can see federal, state. I think there's one more click, Ron, I believe, on the slide. Oh, nope, that's okay. That provides for various types of funding. So we'll go through these, but you often will hear I'm drawing down on something called national funding with 4E, federal funding, but many of our programs, and that's this program today, our session, works outside of 4E, and you can still do incredible, effective prevention work if you are not drawing down 4E dollars. With that said, I do want to encourage the audience to think about accessing 4E, especially in light of the most recent notice of rulemaking that was just issued this year, that we're waiting to actually adopt the manual changes. So I'll speak on that shortly, and I'll speak to what Legal Services of New Jersey has done, which is one of the older prevention programs, well over 500 families served without any removals and separations in New Jersey. That's close to 1,200 children have remained safely with their home families and parents in New Jersey without any intervention of the court or a petition filed. And in that state, there is no 4E funding, so I'll speak and sort of pull that in. Okay, so to our next slide. So this is going back in time a little just to give context, because you'll hear often about 4E and how to fund and draw down federal dollars. 4E originally, in the funding that has been identified, provided for agency funding of services through their attorneys and programs through the agency. In 2018, based on an administrative change, that extended that drawdown and matching through the 4E funding for legal representation that started to include tribal representation, attorneys in the defense end representing children and parents. And this was a huge change. But it's a manual change. Again, it's you know, you have statute, you have legal policy, you have regulations. This is the agency manual, but this is how everything is technically funded. So this was a large change, an amended manual change under the last administration to support legal defense funding. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, based on those few years, you saw the stats, there was an extensive pull down and drawdown of 4E funding. And when we were preparing for the most recent notice of rule that just came out on September 27, 2003, to codify that manual change into a regulation. So that way it would be more secure and less amendable to any changes between administrations or as things evolve. There was always this concern, like, can your manual go back and this funding be eliminated? So in September of this year, the government issued a notice of proposed rule to actually codify that. So this would codify the existing funding that I mentioned before since 2019. It would extend legal representation for children and parents and multidisciplinary models as defined in that regulation change. So this was really exciting to sort of ferment all the work that we've done. Now, there has been 26 jurisdictions, and this is available on the APCAR's website and on Children's Bureau's website, that have been drawing down this 4E funding. And there's close to 16 jurisdictions that were able to use this as prevention. That's what has been identified. So even with the limitations and the regulation limitations that were believed to occur, jurisdictions such as Colorado have been really creative and flexible in their creations of funding arrangements to draw down on these dollars. Now, the hope is if this rule is cemented, which we'll learn in the new year, hopefully, that will then provide more systematic flow of this 4E funding. Next slide, please. And this is, I just want to credit my colleague Allison Green from NACC, just did a poll of the states and regions that have been using 4E funding, claiming you could see this is an active use with the changes, and also including, what's in process, receiving technical assistance. So this is a great source of funding. So just wanted, a minute from the perspective of the organization or program, how exciting this has been used, and just again to emphasize that. But if you're not using 4E, oh, and this is just a slide, and you'll receive copies of these slides about what this actually looks like in process. It is a 50% matching. It doesn't cover all entire cost, and you do need to come up with a cost allocation plan. The one concern that's raised by many parent defenders, family defenders, it is through the Title 4E agency. But what we've learned in the last few years, especially in jurisdictions that have been successful in doing this, is that it is more of a pass-through. And we'll hear more from Ron, like it's done in a way that it's not supervising or delegating what the services are. The discretion is through the community and the agency providing the services, and not through the agency. And now we have information and contracts and examples of how this can be effectively done, and to use it for the advantage of the family-centered model and not through an agency model. Next slide. Thank you. So what if you aren't using 4E, like states like New Jersey and a few other states that we know, including California? I'm reading the comment by Robin Weesey, which we'll hit on, but there are other ways to fund this work. And for example, there are forms of Medicaid that provide legal medical partnerships. This is also available in DC programs. New Jersey has looked into this. And so the Medicaid will often assist with a legal medical partnership where attorneys representing families that enter a hospital, a clinic, through receiving their legal programs. And then they will get assistance on those legal issues while they're in hospital care. Now, again, as with everything, you have to note when you're receiving Medicaid funding, what that actually looks like in your partnership with that program, because in certain states, that will actually reduce sort of the Medicaid services available to the patient. So the New Jersey projects that are funded often use very little Medicaid funding because that started to deplete some of the direct services. Just to note, with any program, what is actually where the funding's going, and not to be a harm, but an add to that patient or client's life. Unlike temporary assistance needy families, there's less obligations and limitations on services. So, for example, there's many programs where welfare will assist a legal partnership where families are represented on, say, for example, Social Security matters and housing matters. So if they're denied housing vouchers or denied Social Security, SSI, SSD, a legal services program can represent these families on those appeals and denials and be funded through TANF. So it's another way of doing creative prevention. This has actually been quite successful. And again, the sense is TANF wants families to receive another type of funding, another sort of assistance support, Social Security, and become stabilized and not rely on receiving TANF dollars, right? And so they're investing in legal prevention in a format to sort of assist these programs. And this is actually one of the more active programs. Next slide. Title 4B is an incredibly effective program that's under a different section of Social Security Act. The issue here is it only right now is 4% of funding for programs in child welfare, but it has the most amount of flexibility. There's no requirements, unlike 4E funding, where you have to be at risk of foster care. And we can spend time debating what at risk is or entering into foster care. But 4B actually gives quite a lot of discretion. It's those resource centers, it's transportation, it's diapers, it's concrete needs for the family without identifying or requiring a case plan. And there's interest and effort in growing 4B federally. So it's some place where if you can invest and look at, or when you're speaking to your agency, this is a place that's underutilized. And why is this not sort of growing and supporting our families? So it's a place to, again, sort of invest in and look at. The other are developmental block grants that you can look through private functions or private ways of concrete ways of looking through community development. This is common in various state jurisdictions or county jurisdictions. Again, gives much more flexibility, and often you'll see them with housing programs or preventing evictions and landlord issues. There's often this need to sort of prevent, obviously, evictions, and community development block grants will invest monies and dollars into organizations that do defense in litigation. And that's a growing place, again, for prevention. Next slide. Okay, this is another place, VOCA. It's the victim assistance. This, again, is an incredible underutilized source for families that when they're seeking typically restraining orders or protection orders, there is availability of federal funds under the Domestic Violence Act that provides for all the things listed and assistance of keeping that survivor safe. And that includes understanding all the things needed to stabilize this individual and their family with their child. So we have used this funding for security, housing security, shelter payments and transportation, assisting with immigration issues. It is incredibly helpful, and it's not, again, lined with conditions or strings attached. It's often like, here's a direct fund or payment to that individual and family. And that, again, sort of reduces the time and need and stress and trauma that our families go through when they're trying to seek immediate assistance. And when you're an attorney and advocate, these are things that you're trying to connect and network quickly together for that individual, preventing sort of the involvement of the child welfare system or intervention that's additionally trauma based, as we know, and you heard from your earlier session. So this is just really helpful as well. Next slide. Okay, so just identifying other ways of thinking about funding and sources. So just briefly on Legal Services of New Jersey, as I said, we do not receive any 4E funding or drawdown on federal report. The prevention is state funded. It's through legal services budget contracted through the governor's office, and it's just been outlined through Legal Services New Jersey's budget. But specifically to the prevention work, we started and partnered with several community organizations that were interested in developing this prevention model and a separation model. And we partnered with a Black-owned organization in Essex, New Jersey, so it was community-based and organized, and the leadership that was developed by this woman named Marge Woods, who's now retired, had worked and organized her organization for over 40 years. So she was well trusted and respected in the community, and she assisted and supported us in creating our first parent ally, advocate, or mentor that provided prevention assistance, Aisha Hammonds, and she co-supervised and managed that program with me. And all the funding went through her program, and she assisted in developing it. The other place to look at was, in fact, our court improvement program. They actually provided some additional funding in a couple of years ago on providing attorney representation, social work representation for prevention work through sort of the CIP money that was coming through training and funding separate from 4E. And that was incredibly important and a turning point for our funding, because it illustrated to our community and to our program that the court system recognized that keeping families out of the court system was critical, that it was important for the court system to actually invest in prevention. And some of the bumps that occurred in sort of negotiating those contracts and understanding to raise that with this group is, would there be a conflict, right? If there was a prevention case that resulted in a removal, can that attorney that was being funded by the CIAP or the court system be able to appear in front of the, in a post-removal situation? And we made clear, yes, that this was client focused, this was legal services run, and there wouldn't be any barrier conditions on the funding in the way that would make most sense to that parent. So happy to sort of go into more details and share more context with that. But in sort of constructing sort of these private agreements or coming up with sort of funding sources to just lean on sort of the parent focus lens, the family lens, to keep them intact, to sort of provide these linkages and to ensure that it's actually meaningful as you create your prevention funding. Next slide. Okay, I think I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. I'm happy to pick up where you've left off, and just want to acknowledge Ron and Jay for being just incredible partners in putting this panel together, the presentation. And I'm sorry you're all named Lauren Nichols today. When I shared my registration link, I thought I was really helping the team out, but sorry for the confusion. Anyways, as Jay provided that expert review of the potential public funding sources that can be leveraged and braided to support this type of work, I'm speaking about private dollars. I represent the Anthony and Jeannie Pritzker Family Foundation, Pritzker Foster Care Initiative. We are a private family foundation in LA, and we've been historically focused on child welfare issues. And for the last 10, 15 years, it's really been transition age foster youth, helping those young people aging out of the system connect to self-sufficiency supports, higher education, workforce development, mental health supports, and all the other critical wraparounds. In 2017, we started to expand our focus in child welfare to really be more about child and family well-being. And this was due to our commissioning the RAND Corporation to conduct a study to really model what was the best use of public dollars. Was it on intervention, supporting those kids and families currently in child welfare, or in prevention? And as I'm sure everyone on this virtual summit can appreciate and intuit deeply, you need to do both. And that's what the study said. So we use that as our rationale to start expanding our funding of prevention. And then in 2018, with the passage of the Family First Prevention Services Act, there became also an external rationale in terms of the policy practice landscape of we can now have public resources to focus on prevention in a meaningful way. And so that really started the ball rolling for our foundation to focus on prevention. Next slide, please. Children's Law Center of California, many of you might know them. They are a phenomenal organization. We have been working with them since 2012. Leslie Heimoff, the executive director there, is an incredible leader in Los Angeles County. And we had been funding their team to help LA County and help the state think about what is the most effective way to implement and leverage Family First dollars. And so we started in 2018, funding their work to do that. And in the course of, I think, a grant report conversation, Leslie had brought up the idea to us of what about CLC launching its own pre-filing intervention? And we didn't understand what that meant, frankly. And so she helped us appreciate, what could be done if we really wanted to focus on prevention, this mechanism of engaging early and disrupting an investigation, providing stabilizing support through case management and legal advocacy to ensure a family wouldn't go through the child welfare system and separation. And certainly that sounded very compelling. And she also helped outline a vision in which she would leverage some of the models of pre-filing intervention work that were happening in other jurisdictions across the country, bringing on an evaluator to, work alongside them as they were laying out this new pilot and ensuring that it was going to be effective for the kids and families that we're serving. And then also, meanwhile, continuing the advocacy and policy work that they were doing to try to draw down on federal public dollars, Title 4E being the primary focus. And so in 2019, we did provide a small gift to CLC, relatively small gift, for them to explore this. And so they called it their PFI work, pre-filing intervention, for their current clients, kids who are currently in child welfare, expecting and parenting youth, with the rationale that if we could engage early, we could stop the intergenerational cycle of child welfare involvement. Next slide, please. And so from 2019 to where we are today, we're really proud that that initial gift, which we continued in the subsequent years, has now become this new initiative for CLC. And they've really been a leader in LA County in the regards of pre-petition advocacy and support. They have two streams, two work streams, dedicated teams focused on this. So the PFI work for those kids who are currently in foster care, expecting and parenting youth, and then also their former clients, who need not necessarily be youth. They could be older, older now, starting families in their late 20s, 30s, and are reaching out to CLC or being referred from Guardian Scholars programs or others in the community. So we're really excited now that this work has really become a significant priority of the organization. They can serve 40 to 50 youth on their caseload. Like I said, they're getting referrals and have a network of partners across LA County to do this work in an effective way. They're also working with LA County's Department of Children and Family Services on a pilot to incorporate into a social worker's process, reaching out to CLC so that they can engage and create to get involved before a petition is filed. They've also been engaging in work groups at the state and county level in terms of advocating for California to be drawing down from Title IV funding, and they've engaged other private funders. Next slide. And so for our foundation, and I'm just speaking on behalf of one foundation, every foundation is very different, but we really focus on relationships. And so I mentioned Leslie, it really was to her credit of bringing this idea to us, helping us understand it. And we were then comfortable, and we've been comfortable as a foundation to provide that kind of risk capital to start something new, and let's see what happens. And so we started that in 2019, and we saw it really as a way to, one, help them establish something that was really meaningful, but also to serve as a bridge to public funding opportunities down the road, and being a meaningful way, again, to shift from child protection to child and family well-being, which we really care deeply about. And so their advocacy for systems change at policy and practice level has been baked into this. So that really is the work that we've been doing with CLC. They deserve all of the credit. It's not often that we are on a panel. We usually like to cheer our leaders from behind, but I'm so proud to be speaking about their work, and certainly happy to answer any questions that anyone might have at the end of the presentation. Now turning it over to Ron.
Thank you very much. And Lauren, I echo what you said at the beginning. I truly appreciate the opportunity to work with both of you. It's been wonderful. And I think I'm the first to recognize and admit that I'm sort of an atypical participant in this particular endeavor. I am general counsel for the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, but way back it was in 2013, I was asked by the then director of the Department of Human Services to look into the possibility of getting into arranging a contractual relationship with the legal aid services group here in Oklahoma. And so we reached out, we had discussions, and the purpose was to find ways that we would be able to offer avenues of legal representation for families whose their children were either in care or at risk of being brought into care. If they had these legal obstacles, ancillary legal matters is how we termed them, ancillary legal matters that were threatening the stability of a home. And so we managed to come up with a contract, worked with Michael Figgins here at Legal Aid in Oklahoma, and it has been working ever since. And the primary reason behind this contract that we have with legal aid, we eliminate the legal issues, and if we can eliminate those legal issues, the hope is that we can provide that stability in the home. And so the contract, it's both pre-petition and it's both post-petition. If we had our druthers, if we could get that legal intervention as early as possible before a petition is filed, that's the goal. And so, it's recognized that there are domestic matters, things like custody, paternity. If you've got issues with regard to housing, utilities, if there's word brought to the attention of the worker that there might be application for benefits, troubles getting benefits. And so then we utilize this contract to provide these legal services for these families. I will say that the primary, I call them, the core 5 cases that come through this contract are your guardianships, establishing paternity, divorces, modification of custody, VPOs, things like that. But we also have been working in years past to stress to the workers. I'll explain a little bit. This is a worker-driven contract, to be honest, but we've been emphasizing the need to expand beyond those core groups of legal matters, this core group of legal matters, and get into the benefit eligibility, the housing issues that are threatening, if someone's being threatened with eviction, et cetera, then we can utilize this contract for that purpose. Applying for unemployment insurance, individuals who have had their licenses revoked, they can work to get those reinstated. If there are criminal records that need to be expunged, this is what that contract can be utilized for. I did want to point out that with regard to the contract, it does not cover criminal appellate matters. It doesn't cover adoptions, and it does not cover termination of parental rights. We have worked into the contract, however, that there is a possibility for legal aid to provide representation in the actual deprived case. We like to make that sort of rarely used at times and focus on those other ancillary legal matters, but we do have it built into the contract as sort of a last-ditch effort. If the family does need representation with regard to the deprived case, they can utilize this contract for that purpose. Also, the contract itself, the funding does not cover costs such as expert witnesses and examinations. Like I said, this is a worker-driven effort, and we rely on the workers to recognize if there are potential legal matters that could be impacting the family. And so we rely on the worker to then communicate to that family that through this brochure that I'm showing you, that if you bring this to your legal aid office or make a phone call to your legal aid office, mention that you were referred through this contract, and that would be the funding that would be utilized by legal aid. Legal aid would know to utilize this contract for that legal inquiry. As I said, worker-driven referrals, but we are not, we also rely heavily on courts to intervene. I have, in a couple of months ago, I was at our CIP conference and gave a presentation both here and up in Tulsa, here in Oklahoma, to the courts, encouraging them to remember that they've got this contract through legal aid, and to remember the availability if they come across issues that seem to be threatening family stability, that they can mention to the worker that, hey, let's get this family involved with the family representation and stabilization contract through legal aid, and maybe we can resolve some of these issues. We've also gone as far as reaching out also to attorneys at that same CIP conference. We would like attorneys to recognize there is an availability, and they can reach out to the worker and tell the worker that if there's something that's threatening stability in the home, like a possible eviction, then they can utilize this contract for that purpose. And what Jey mentioned earlier on during her presentation, this is a TANF-funded contract. We have relied on, Social Security Act 42 USC Section 601. Like Jey had mentioned, we've got these two highlighted portions where it's emphasizing family stability. And so we have made the effort to modify the state plan to incorporate the use of the state funds. It falls outside the definition of assistance, so there's no means testing. Since this expenditure is something that falls within the Child Welfare Program of Oklahoma, it does fall within that definition of strengthening and keeping families together. So that's the rationale that we use to fund this effort through TANF. And that's what we've been utilizing pretty much since the contract began, which was, I think, like one of the slides noted to pass, it's been in effect since 2014. And so it's something that I will say this, it's always been an effort to generate awareness about this contract. That's one of the difficulties that we have because of worker turnover, because it's just quite often not necessarily first and foremost on the minds of workers and individuals. These ancillary legal matters, they often have other issues on their minds when it comes to addressing the needs or the issues with the family. So that's always been a constant struggle. We always have to have, I call it I feel like we've been on tour as long as the Rolling Stones promoting this concert, promoting this contract. That's what Legal Aid Services and I, representative, we go around the state. We talk with the workers, we talk with the judges, we talk with attorneys when we can to let them know about this contract. But it has something that has made an impact. And we've even made it a research study with the University of Oklahoma to test the effectiveness of the contract. And that's something that's continuing. So that was kind of my spiel. Jey and Lauren, we're happy to answer any questions. I think we have about 9 minutes left for that effort.
Thank you guys so much. I think you've provided some wonderful examples of kind of the dynamic funding, right, that's available and what that can look like across different types of programs. So I really appreciate that. I haven't seen, I'm sure people have questions. So if you do, please drop them in the Q&A because we do have a few minutes to go through some of those. I did note, Jey, I'm going to toss this one to you because Valerie had made a comment. So talking about penetration rates when we're looking at that 50% reimbursement on Title IV-E, I know you and I talk about that a lot, but do you want to just kind of shed a little light on kind of the role of the penetration rate when we're looking at that reimbursement level?
Exactly. Yes. And thank you, Valerie. And even Robin VC from New Jersey's comment about sort of the bigger picture of struggling, unlike if you don't work with someone like Ron, sometimes the agency struggle having contract. But the penetration rate, that's a great point to raise. Everyone who's here or just kind of resourcing whether or not how their state is receiving federal funding. And so I spend a lot of time, not only in New Jersey's, but any sort of state that I'm working out, if it's county-based, state funded, what their budget is actually delegated. A lot of it is open to the public, very much Googleable. You find out where the money is going. And it's important to know that because what is often said when you're in court, right, is I have to agree to reasonable efforts. I have to agree to this. So I check the right boxes as a judge to get federal reimbursement. And that is what connects back to penetration rate. How much is your state actually receiving from the feds goes to that number. So it's reimbursed at 50%. But many times when you actually unpack that, until I started doing my own audit and working with the state here and now with other states, it's not like a windfall. Like each child, you send out a contract saying, reimburse me for this removal at this rate, at this amount, and then that caseworker and family gets this certain amount. It's often done in chunks of time, periods of time. At the end of the year is the submission, and Ron can speak to this personally, I'm sure, or even like how you receive sort of any sort of state contract funding back is not as clear as we like to think. And that is based on your penetration rate, actually, if you qualify for the federal funding. So as noted in the chat, sometimes it says at 50%, but the state might be really closer to 20%. So for example, I know in New Jersey, certain counties are at like 35 to 40% and less. Being in states like in Arkansas, recently saw it's actually on the lower side of receiving that federal reimbursement. And that's based on the submissions, whether the documents are in place, whether or not there were efforts to place with kin. That's a large part of it. That's a large reason why states don't receive some of the federal funding. So just to note again, like when you're having sort of these debates about losing money for your state or you're going to get substitute for state funding, really know what your state is receiving, how that's coming through, the payment process. I think you'll be better armed when you're coming into these, engaging with your state agency on what an agreement looks like at 4E or any funding opportunity. When someone throws at you, well, you can receive that money from the state or the feds, that's just not necessarily true. So just do your homework, and happy to sort of guide and reach out to me if you're tracking those things, like what exactly you need to look at and who to ask to. And like I said, it could be county, it could be town, municipal based, I've learned, and it varies. So great question and great point.
And that is there are a significant number of misperceptions about the the amount of funding that you receive through these 4E, et cetera. And it's been a process. And I think more and more folks here in Oklahoma that are involved in it, they're becoming more aware. But it has been a process.
Thank you both for that response. So I'm going to address the two things that are kind of pending in the question. So Robert had asked about the fact that these changes had occurred under the Trump administration. I just wanted to draw attention, Robert, that I said Vivek answered it, but it was actually Steph who provided a great answer. But that was Jerry Milner working then with ACF's, or who was the ACF Associate Commissioner at that time. And so they did a lot of these, were pivotal in getting a lot of these changes through. And I think we've kind of addressed Crystal's question, which was, does anyone have tips for working with their 4E agency to increase the use of 4E funding? I know you guys have talked, you've touched on that, but, and I would say really, I think that could go for the TANF side too, as well, right? And looking at Ron's program, but just, what do you have any tips for anyone as to trying to encourage state cooperation and involvement, because that's necessary both on the 4E side and when we look at these other states' funding sources. So any tips for people trying to encourage the state to move on these things?
Just really briefly, and it just had on the 4B side, it's cost saving. I think Emily and I presented, we talked about this, outside of the constitutional protected rights and maybe the moral standpoint of keeping families together and reducing trauma and intervention the way that we know it, it is cost saving to the state. So again, looking at how much is spent on foster care, out of home care, what dollars are spent there. So just even raising those numbers, especially in true poverty states where there's such a discrepancy between the families being served and the cost of living and meeting the basic needs for families in your jurisdiction. So encouraging just doing the basic math of like, if child is in foster care and straight to foster care for 3 to 6 months, versus staying home and receiving sort of the prevention assistance that we've outlined, what are sort of the numbers that you're gaining? And across the board, it is incredibly cost saving to the state, to the feds, and really obviously critical to the family to stay securely and safely together.
And I guess I would only add that, groups shouldn't hesitate to bring these to the attention of the agency, that, it is recognized, like Jey just said. I mean, these are cost saving efforts. And I'm surely hopeful that I'm not being naive when, that the agency should be very, very receptive to these ideas of utilizing these funding sources through the feds. And so I would just encourage folks, and I hope I'm not being naive, that encourage folks to reach out to their state agency and have these discussions with them, because there is, and in Oklahoma, there is an awareness of that, the availability of this funding and the savings that can incur as a consequence of it. And I would surely hope that would be reflected or echoed in the 49 other states and and territories that we've got.
And you mentioned, Ron, the evaluation that you all are doing of your program there in Oklahoma. And any word on when that evaluation might be ready for other people to utilize as they go to convince their own jurisdictions?
We've got an initial report that I'm happy to share. It really is more sort of reflective of what the possibilities are. It's not more as data driven as I'd hoped, and so that's what I am working with OU's School of Social Work to get more on the efficacy of the program. So that's what I want to get, because I want to find out how effective this program is. Right now, I'm just working off basically anecdotal information. I'll have an attorney here in the DHS, the Legal Services Division for our department, that will look at the cases individually and make an assessment or a determination as to whether that attorney thought that the outcome of the case was impacted positively or negatively by the representation contract. So it's an ongoing process, but yes, I mean, without a doubt, if we ever get that that data out there, it's something that I would be happy to share.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron. And then Lauren, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know we're close to the end of the session and we'll start the break here in just a minute. But just to round things out, do you have any kind of final thoughts or comments to programs out there that may be trying to capture some private foundation funds, or, you know, speaking with other individuals about that angle? Any thoughts you would want to leave them with in that?
Well, I think it's I think it's very compelling to a foundation where their dollars can be used to help leverage public funding. And so to the extent that you're in a jurisdiction where you can draw down public funds, or you have a vision to kind of capture some of the braided opportunities that Jey was outlining at the top, and position to that to a family foundation, to a private funder, and say, could you help us get something off the ground? This would be a bridge. Then it could be self-sustaining, or we would need less and less private dollars. And that's a really compelling proposal to a foundation. And that's, you know, what Leslie and the CLC team and I had talked about way back when.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so very much for a wonderful presentation. Excuse me. There is one more. I'm going to go ahead and put us on break, but if you guys will just take a look, there was one more question open in the Q&A at the bottom. If you guys could peruse that and get an answer in quick over the break, that would be great. But thank you all again so very much for a great presentation. And we are going to go on another 10-minute break, and we will be back at 11:40.